Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of sources and really dig in to help you get properly well informed. Today, we're looking into a really quite shocking aviation mystery. It happened back on May 5, 2007. So picture this. Kenya Airways Flight 507, it's a Boeing 737, takes off from Douala in Cameroon right into this, driving wind and rain.
Right.
Moments later, it banks. And not just banks, it goes into an ever-steepening spiral, then a high-speed dive. And in less than a minute, literally less than 60 seconds after lifting off, it plunges into a swamp. Everyone on board, 114 people, passengers and crew, killed.
Yeah, it's chilling. And what really struck investigators almost immediately was the sense that the pilot seemed, well, the report used the phrase, dangerously under-equipped.
Under-equipped to handle the plane.
Exactly. Once it got outside its sort of normal flight conditions, its normal flight envelope, they couldn't cope. It seems like it led straight to panic in the cockpit.
And, what makes this even more unsettling, really, is that this wasn't the first time for Kenya Airways, was it?
No. Unfortunately not. Our sources really highlight this.
Yeah.
Just 7 years before, back in January 2000, you had Flight 431. That was an Airbus A310.
Also crashed right after takeoff.
Off of Abidjan. 169 people died in that one. And the cause there, pilot disorientation again, but this time triggered by a false stall warning.
Wow. So, 2 fatal crashes, both soon after takeoff, both involving pilot disorientation within 7 years. That really makes you wonder, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. You have to ask, was there something deeper going on? A systemic problem, perhaps?
Right.
So that's really our mission for this deep dive. We want to explore these, twin tragedies. We're going to focus particularly on this really insidious threat, something aviators call the silent, deadly 1G turn.
Okay.
We'll unpack what happened moment by moment in the cockpit of Flight 507, look at the human factors, the systemic issues that all kind of came together. And ultimately what this whole thing tells us about, critical thinking in high-pressure situations and this concept called airmanship.
Okay, so let's set the scene a bit more for Kenya Airways. I mean, they had a pretty good reputation before this period, right? One of Africa's most respected airlines.
Yeah, for decades they flew without a fatal accident. They were actually the first flag carrier on the continent to be partially privatized.
Really?
And the first and still the only African airline to join the SkyTeam Alliance. So, outwardly, things look good. But our sources suggest that as they grew really rapidly in the 2000s, they kind of found themselves on this tragically steep safety learning curve.
That first crash, Flight 431 in 2000, seems like a stark example of that curve.
It really does. So imagine, dark night, taking off from Abidjan in that Airbus A310. Suddenly, a stall warning starts blaring.
Okay.
Now, the thing is, a quick check instruments, speed, altitude, pitch would have shown it was false. There's no stall.
But they didn't do that check.
The first officer, reacting instinctively, with maybe only seconds, just a few hundred feet up, he pushed the nose down. He applied the stall recovery procedure.
For a stall that wasn't happening.
Exactly. And then things got even more confusing. The overspeed warning started blaring too.
Wait, so the plane's telling them they're too fast and too slow at the same time?
Precisely. Imagine the confusion. Plus, the radio altimeter's counting down rapidly. 50, 40, 30, 20, 10.
Oh my God.
The captain shouted, "Go up!" But it was just too late. Slammed into the Atlantic. 169 killed, only 10 survivors.
That's horrific. And it really highlights what you mentioned earlier, airmanship.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
It's about more than just reacting to warnings. It's that sort of intuitive grasp of what the aircraft is actually doing. It requires, a clear head, logical thinking, questioning assumptions, especially false signals. It's something cultivated through really rigorous training.
That kind of innate quality.
Yeah. And it's something that could have saved, frankly, many crews who lost control of planes that were perfectly flyable.
Which tragically brings us forward 7 years to Flight 507, May 4th, 2007. This was an evening flight, Abidjan to Nairobi, stopping in Douala, Cameroon.
Right. And this time it's a different plane. A Boeing 737-800.
Yeah.
Newer generation.
And the pilots.
Captain Francis Wamweya, 52 years old. Experienced over 8,600 flight hours. And First Officer Andrew Kiru, much younger, just 23, and pretty new to the airline, only about 800 hours total.
Okay, so quite an experience gap there.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And even before they took off from Douala, you could see, potential issues brewing. Thunderstorms were rolling and pretty common there in Central Africa.
Right.
They were already running late. And Captain Wamweya actually canceled their initial engine start clearance because the weather looked bad. They ended up waiting another 20 minutes or so on the ground.
And the cockpit voice recorder, the CVR, caught some interesting interactions even before takeoff, didn't it?
It did. Little things, but telling. Wanwei told Kiru to put his wipers on, then sort of chided him. You're struggling to look, and you got wipers. Later, Kiru, who was the monitoring pilot, was ready to call air traffic control. Wanwei says, wait first, then clarifies, no, I mean wait till we line up. Kiru explains, okay, things usually happen in a hurry, that's why. And Wanwei just chuckles, okay, you're keeping up with it, eh?
So what did investigators make of that early back and forth? Does it suggest anything about their relationship?
Well, it perhaps hinted at a bit of tension, or definitely that authority gradient we talked about, a sort of power imbalance.
Okay.
What's also interesting is, as they finally lined up, Captain Wanwei himself radios ATC to request a weather deviation right after takeoff. He initially says turn slightly left, but the radar clearly showed the worst weather was to the left.
So Kiru corrected him.
Yeah, Kiru pointed out the radar showed better weather to the right. Wanwei then corrected himself to the tower. But then, oddly, they actually took off without getting explicit clearance for that takeoff roll. A weird mistake, though probably not directly linked to the crash itself.
All right, so they're finally airborne, climbing out over these mangrove swamps near Douala. And this is where this silent, deadly 1G turn phenomenon really starts. What exactly is that?
Okay, so as soon as they lifted off, the plane started a very slow, gentle turn to the right. This wasn't commanded by the pilots. It was likely due to some minor natural asymmetry, maybe a bit of right rudder trim, they'd said.
It's just a slight drift.
Yeah, very sedate, easily correctable. And Captain Wanwei did correct it a couple of times initially, rolling the wings back towards level.
Okay, so far so good. What makes it silent and deadly?
Right. The insidious card is this. When you're flying at night or in clouds without any outside visual reference, your body, specifically your inner ear, which handles balance, it can't distinguish sustained acceleration, like in a turn, from the constant pull of gravity.
So your senses lie to you?
Essentially, yes. Your brain gets conflicting information. A steady, smooth roll, like this 1G turn, feels exactly the same as flying straight and level. You don't feel the turn happening. That's why pilots are drilled, absolutely drilled, to trust their instruments, especially the artificial horizon, above everything else.
So Wanwei would have felt the change when he made those corrections, right? Rolling from right back to left.
Exactly. He'd feel the acceleration of the correction. But his vestibular system, his inner ear, might interpret that correction not as leveling the wings from a right bank, but as initiating a left turn from level flight.
Even though the instruments showed something else.
Correct. His instruments would show the wings leveling, but his body might be telling him he's now banking left.
Yeah.
He was initially overcoming this, like pilots are trained to do, by relying on those instruments. But then came the critical moment.
What happened?
Captain Wanwei says, okay, command. He's telling First Officer Kiru to engage the autopilot. He wants it in command mode, giving it full control.
And
Kiru never replied. Never said, okay, never confirmed. And crucially, he never actually pressed the button to engage the autopilot.
He didn't engage it. Why not?
We don't know for sure. The sources suggest maybe he was distracted, perhaps looking at the weather radar. Maybe he didn't hear the captain clearly over the noise and workload. There was also a note earlier about a potential intermittent fault with the autopilot, though it seemed okay then.
But the key thing is, he didn't engage it, and he didn't say anything.
Exactly. No confirmation call. And just as importantly, Wanwei didn't follow up when Kiru didn't respond. He didn't ask, is it engaged, or autopilot status.
So a complete communication breakdown at the worst possible moment.
Catastrophic. You ended up with this profound misunderstanding. Wanwei assumed the autopilot was flying. Kiru, well, maybe he assumed Wanwei was still hand flying, or perhaps he was just momentarily distracted.
And the result?
Nobody touched the controls for a full 55 seconds.
Nearly a minute.
Nearly a minute. And all that time, that slow, smooth, silent 1G turn just continued, banking the plane further and further to the right.
Undetected.
Undetected by Wanwei's senses and uncorrected because everyone thought someone or something else was flying. The plane rolled right through 30 degrees, then 40, 50.
And Kiru, the monitoring pilot, didn't notice either.
Well, the investigators believe Kiru actually did see the bank increasing on his instruments, but he likely misinterpreted it. He probably thought Captain Wanwei was intentionally making this steep turn, maybe for weather avoidance.
Oh, right, because they discussed turning right earlier.
Exactly. So Kiru, trying to be helpful, actually adjusted the target heading bug on the display to 165 degrees, trying to match what he thought the captain was doing.
Oh, no. So he's essentially validating the incorrect maneuver in his own mind.
Pretty much. Then suddenly, Wanwei does notice the bank angle. He makes some exclamation like, huh, or whoa. Almost immediately after that, the bank hits 35 degrees, triggering loud bank angle, oral warning.
That must have startled him.
Completely caught him by surprise. And remember, that spatial disorientation, his inner ear was likely still telling him he was banking left because of those earlier corrections. So faced with this loud alarm and his own faulty senses, what did he do?
He didn't trust the instruments.
This is where panic seems to have set in, overriding training. His artificial horizon was right there, clearly showing a steep, increasing right bank. But instead of correcting smoothly to the left, he yanked the control column. First right, then left, then hard right again.
He made it worse.
Much worse. He rapidly increased the roll rate to the right. The bank angle shot past 50 degrees, heading towards 60, 70.
And the autopilot was still off this whole time.
Still off. Only then did Wamwea seem to realize it. He slammed the CMD button. But because he was already putting so much pressure on the control column, fighting the plane, it didn't engage in the normal command mode.
What mode did it go into?
It engaged in something called control wheel steering, or CWS.
Yeah.
In CWS, the autopilot basically just holds whatever attitude the pilot inputs to the controls. But there's a crucial safety feature. If CWS engages when the bank is already beyond 30 degrees, it's programmed to slowly, gently roll the plane back towards a safer 30-degree bank.
So even at this late stage, recovery was still possible.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This was the critical moment. If Wamwea had just let go of the controls right then, the autopilot, even in CWS, would have started to roll the wings back towards level. It would have been slow, but it would have worked.
But he didn't let go.
He didn't. He seems to have become frustrated that the autopilot wasn't instantly snapping the wings level, which isn't what CWS does in that situation. He grabbed the controls again, physically overpowering the autopilot servos.
Fighting the system that was trying to save them.
Essentially, yes. He started swinging the controls wildly again, rolling it even further right. Within seconds, the bank hit 90 degrees. They were rolling inverted.
Oh my God.
He shouted, "We are crashing." And you hear Kuru, who seems to have been watching his own instruments, confirm, "Right, yes, we are crashing. Right, left, correction, left."
So Kuru knew which way to correct.
Sounds like it. Kuru grabbed his own controls, trying to roll left. But Wamwea was still fighting him, still inputting right roll commands. They were working against each other.
Complete chaos.
The plane just corkscrewed downwards from only about 2,000 feet, utterly out of control. The CVR picks up Kuru, shouting an expletive, a brief GPWS pull-up alarm, and then silence.
Just like that.
Kenya Airways Flight 507 pitched steeply down, banked about 60 degrees right, hit that mangrove swamp at something like 530 kilometers per hour, gouged a huge crater. All 114 people gone instantly.
And the crash site, it wasn't found immediately, was it?
No, tragically. Even though it was only a few kilometers from the airport, it went largely unnoticed in the storm and swamp. No alarm was raised until the plane just never showed up in Nairobi hours later.
And finding the wreckage took time.
Almost 2 days. Partly because initial reports of a flash in the sky led search teams way off course, like 160 kilometers away.
And the black boxes.
Also a challenge. The swamp made recovery difficult. The CDR, the cockpit voice recorder, had actually broken into 4 pieces, and the locator beacon, the pinger, had detached. Took over a month just to find the crucial memory module.
But once they got the data,
the picture became horribly clear, a classic case, really, of spatial disorientation in the roll axis. It's a problem that's been documented since the earliest days of flying in clouds or at night.
So while Kuru seemed aware, Wamwea was clearly disoriented. This must have led investigators to look much closer at Captain Wamwea himself.
It did. And when they dug into his training records and history, well, more red flags started to pop up.
Like what?
His overall skills assessments were often marked as below average. Specific comments mentioned struggles with crew resource management, CRM systems knowledge, following standard procedures, even basic instrument scanning. Situational awareness and decision-making were also flagged as weak points.
So these weren't new issues?
Not entirely. There was even a specific incident noted in a 2004 training flight where he failed to properly discuss a simulated failure with his first officer. The pattern was there.
It sounds like it went beyond just technical flying skills. Was there anything about his personality?
Yes, reports from instructors and even some colleagues described him as, well, overbearing, maybe even arrogant. A tendency to belittle or talk down to first officers.
And the CVR seemed to back that up.
Sadly, yes. On the flight into Douala, just before the accident leg, the CVR recorded Wamwea calling First Officer Kuru stupid and telling him to shut up at one point.
Wow, that creates a terrible cockpit environment.
Absolutely. And it speaks directly to that authority gradient issue. When you have a captain who is perceived as overbearing, maybe intimidating, combined with that kind of belittling language.
It makes it incredibly difficult for a junior first officer like Kiru with so much less experience to speak up, right? To challenge or intervene even when things are clearly going wrong.
The psychological barrier becomes huge. Even if Kiru knew they were banking dangerously right, questioning or trying to take control from this particular captain would have been incredibly difficult.
So, while Wamwe's disorientation and panic were the immediate cause, it seems like his personality and this authority gradient were massive contributing factors.
Definite. But the investigation didn't stop there. It also pointed fingers at Kenya Airways' own systems.
How so?
Well, they had all this information in Wamwe's training records about his recurring weaknesses. But apparently no one ever looked at his entire training history holistically.
They only looked at one training session at a time.
Exactly. Each check flight or training event was reviewed in isolation. So the pattern, the accumulating risk, was never properly identified or addressed until it was too late.
That seems like a major systemic failure.
It was highlighted as such. And furthermore, their actual operating procedures might have contributed to that crucial communication breakdown about the autopilot.
In what way?
The procedures were apparently ambiguous. They didn't clearly state who was responsible for engaging the autopilot, the pilot flying, or the pilot monitoring. They didn't specify a standard altitude for engagement. And crucially...
Let me guess, no required confirmation call.
Exactly. There was no required standard call-out to confirm that the autopilot had been successfully engaged, even though Boeing, the manufacturer, recommended such a call-out.
So if Wamwe had been trained to always expect that confirmation call from Kiru,
he would have known immediately that something was wrong when Kiru didn't respond. That simple call-out could potentially have broken the chain and prevented the crash.
So wrapping this up, what's the big picture here? When you look at both Flight 507 and Flight 431, what's the ultimate lesson?
Well, taken together, these two tragedies really point to something deeply troubling. A fundamental failure in what we call airmanship, which seemed rooted in a wider, perhaps cultural problem within the airline's training or operational philosophy at the time.
A cultural problem?
Yeah, it suggests that maybe the focus was too much on just procedural compliance and not enough on cultivating that deeper intuitive understanding of flight, of situational awareness, and crucially, of fostering open, assertive communication in the cockpit, regardless of rank.
So Captain Wamwe, despite all those documented issues, was allowed to keep flying.
With ultimately catastrophic results. It's really sobering. You have the subtle danger of the 1G turn, the catastrophic communication failure over the autopilot, Captain Wamwe's disorientation and panic, amplified by his personality, and that steep authority gradient.
All converging.
All converging. And then you layer on the airline's own systemic issues, not reviewing pilot history properly, having ambiguous procedures. It just paints this incredibly clear, tragic picture of how multiple small failures can cascade into utter disaster.
And our source material leaves us hanging a bit, doesn't it? It mentions this cultural problem, but says, what caused it and what was done to fix it. That story is yet to be told.
Right. It leaves you wondering.
So maybe the final thought for you listening is this. When these seemingly small communication gaps meet maybe more deeply rooted cultural issues, and they run up against fundamental human physiological limits like spatial disorientation, the results can be devastating. What does this deep dive into Flight 507 really tell you about how vital it is in any high-stakes field, not just to have technical skill, but also truly robust communication, psychological safety, and a commitment to continuous, holistic learning?